Hey friends, we're in chapter 2. We're looking at operations with integers, and today we're going to talk about integers and absolute value. Our vocabulary is as follows. We're going to talk about negative numbers, positive numbers, integers, a coordinate, inequality, and the term absolute value. I'm going to look at each one of these kind of separately on the slide, a couple of these separately on the slide. So the first, negative numbers are any numbers that are less than 0. They usually have a little negative sign in front of them. And positive numbers are numbers that are greater than 0. Just note that 0 is neither negative or positive. All right, so the next one, when we talk about integers, what we're talking about are positive and negative whole numbers. Sometimes I refer to integers as number line numbers. So in almost every class that you've had, there's a number line up, and usually the only numbers you see on the number line are positive whole numbers and negative whole numbers. So that's what integers are. All right. Coordinate is just the number that corresponds to a location on a number line. So here I've drawn a number line with our integers, and I can call -1 a coordinate, but I could also put a dot right here and notice that what I'm referring to is -1/2, and that would be a coordinate in that case. The next thing we're going to discuss is the concept of inequality. Inequality means not equal. So when we talk about things that are not equal in mathematics, we often use comparison symbols, such as these. But I need to add a little bit here. There we go. So we've got less than or equal to, that's what that line means underneath, greater than or equal to, or greater than. So those are the 4 symbols that we're going to use. Sometimes you might see this, and this may be considered an inequality, where you just put a equal sign and a slash through it and you say they're not equal. But typically when we're talking about inequalities, those are the symbols that we're going to be using. And finally, the concept of absolute value. Some people talk about absolute value as just making a number positive, and that's not exactly it. If we look at a number line, right, and we consider the distance of each number from 0, realize, like, if I am here in Germantown and I decide to go to North Philadelphia, or I decide to go to South Philadelphia, and I'm going 2 miles to North Philadelphia or 2 miles to South Philadelphia, I talk about that distance as just 2 miles. Doesn't matter the direction I'm going in. So when we talk about absolute value, we don't really consider the direction, whether it's negative or positive. We're just talking about the distance. So if I were to put, let's say this is 0 and this is -3 here, and this is +2, and this is +4. If I were to ask you the absolute value of each of these numbers, let's say the absolute value of 2, what is the distance from 2 to 0? Hopefully you know it's just 2. So the absolute value of 2 is 2. What about the absolute value of -3? Let me make a little bit more space for myself there. What about the absolute value of -3? It's just 3. So the reason why people say absolute value means to make it positive is because whenever you have the absolute value, it can never be negative, right? Because we're talking about distance. Just as I'd say I'm 2 miles from whatever place I want to go to in North Philly or South Philly, I would say 2 miles and I wouldn't give it direction. So in a sense, absolute value makes things positive, but really what we're talking about is the distance of a number from 0. All right, with that in mind, here's all of our vocabulary together. If you didn't get a chance to copy, do so now, pause it, and we're going to move on to some examples. Here's our first example. Example 1, write an integer for each situation. So we know that negative and positive numbers can be used to represent real life situations, and we're going to just do that now. If we're talking about 23 degrees below 0, we know that that is less than 0, so we're talking about -23. 11 inches more than normal. Considering normal is something that we expect, we kind of think of that as 0, and if we're talking about 11 inches above, we're talking about +11. A loss of 8 yards. When we refer to things that are lost, that's a negative situation, and we're subtracting or taking away, so that's a -8. And finally, if somebody wants to deposit money into your account, a deposit of $15 is a positive thing, and so we put +15. Let's take a look at this next example. Example 2, compare 2 integers. So we're going to write an inequality comparing these 2 integers. We have -1 and 2. Now they're not equal, obviously, and we talked about the symbols that we would use: less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, or greater than. Which symbol best fits between these two numbers? Hopefully you guys all recognize that less than makes sense because -1 is less than 2. Replace this empty box here with less than, greater than, or equal to make this statement here true. So I'm going to rewrite it. -3 has a relationship to -7. Which one is greater? Think first. Our knee-jerk reaction might be to say that -3 is less than -7, but remember, when we're thinking about the number line, -3 would be here and -7 would be back here. So -7, let me write that nicely, is less than. So we need to write our symbol this way. -3 is greater than -7. All right. Example 3, we're ordering integers. So now what we're going to do is order them from least to greatest, and we're looking at it as if we're placing it on the number line. So which is the smallest of these numbers? That would be this guy, the most negative, the -5. Next would be -1. Next would be 0. Then we have 1, 2, and then 4. And that's it. That's all we need to do here. So make sure you remember that you're thinking about how you would place these numbers on a number line. And our final example is that we're going to deal with expressions that have absolute value. So the first one you guys should be good at, given our definition of absolute value in our discussion. The absolute value of -4 is, so we're thinking about the distance from 0, is simply +4. Here, this is a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to write it a little bit larger so we can kind of analyze what's happening. The first thing you want to do when you have an expression that you want to simplify with absolute values is to go in and handle the absolute value situation. Then you want to figure out what's going on. In a sense, absolute value symbol is kind of like a parenthesis. So if I go in here and I have a parenthesis, it tells me deal with this thing in parentheses first. So I'm going to deal with the absolute value first. The absolute value of -8 is a +8. And the absolute value of a +5 is simply 5. So this is now rewritten to look like this. 8 minus 5 is 3, and that's our final answer. Make sense? Guys, if this did not make sense, make sure and talk to me in class, and we'll see if we can work on some of this together, because I know absolute value can be tricky. Here's our final example with absolute value. Example 5 gives us an algebraic expression where we're going to do some substitution. So I've got 6 plus the absolute value of x, and we're going to evaluate this if we know that x is equal to -2. So again, I'm going to rewrite it exactly as I should by simply replacing the variable with the known value. And now I'm going to analyze like we did the last one. So the absolute value of -2 is +2, so this whole thing is rewritten in this way. 6 plus 2 is going to give me 8, and that's my final answer. Not too bad, right? Make sure, I'm going to leave the assignment, make sure you take a look at the assignment in your packet. Make sure you feel comfortable with this. Ask me any questions that you have. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have an excellent day. Bye-bye.